He said, well, this is very interesting, this particular design, because it encodes this theorem, which is really, really difficult to create on a piece of paper. Now, why would anyone do this in the middle of the night using an imprecise canvas called wheat? And he had a very good point. If you're going to try and convince academics that you are very clever, why not submit your dissertation and have it peer-reviewed, rather than stay out for 5 hours of total darkness and try and plank it in a field of wheat? This is how you approach the subject from the hoaxed point of view, and by the time you finish with the argument, you are left with very little impression that actually humans couldn't really do this. Clever guy. But what Gerald Hawkins also did was very interesting, because he actually discovered, for the first time since the time of the Greeks, I'm talking about, I think it's 100 BC here, that he's found 4 new geometric theorems based on the works of Euclid. Now, Euclid is the fundamental basis of our entire knowledge of mathematics in the world today. And what he found was that these theorems are actually not found in Euclid's 13 books on mathematics, which is kind of weird, because he said, well, by logic, and Euclid was a pretty clever guy, he said, well, by logic, Euclid would have actually figured these next 4 theorems, and I found them in crop circles. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And what else, Gerald? He said, well, this is really clever. I actually, in a moment of, I'm sure you'd call it something else, but I'll call it consciousness moment. He said, I've actually worked out that if you extrapolate from these 4 new theorems in the crop circles by logic, there's a 5th theorem, which is, you should get to quite easily. And he published a theorem. Actually, no, he didn't publish. He put the challenge in a book, I think it was a magazine that it was read by 200,000 mathematicians around the world. And he said, let's think about this for a second. If people are making crop circles, then it's very difficult to create a mathematical theorem, let alone make one in the middle of the night in wheat. So how come these 4 theorems exist? In fact, how come we can now take these 4 theorems and create a 5th theorem from them, and I will buy anybody a crate of champagne if you can tell me how to extrapolate this 5th theorem that does not exist from these 4. So that was the test. Well, weeks went by, nobody cracked the code. On the 4th week, this thing appears in the middle of England, and it actually has the theorem in it. So there's a bit of a joke going on here, and it happens all the time, and it makes you wonder who's watching what we're doing, because they have a nasty habit of doing this stuff all the time. So again, 200,000 mathematicians peer-reviewed this paper, and they said, well, the conclusion is that obviously there must be another explanation to boards and pieces of string. I thought that was pretty impressive until one day, this beautiful little thing shows up, not far from where I used to live. There were 2, I want to call them engineers, yes. They were engineers. One is a physicist, and they were from London. And it also got their attention, and why not? I mean, it's absolutely delicious. You want to almost eat it. We're back to dessert again. They thought, this is really interesting. They got on the car, they drove 2.5 hours to the middle of Wiltshire, because something about this design really got their attention. I mean, they just put down all of their papers, and they thought, let's go and do this. And they began to measure it. Rulers, all that kind of stuff, laser pointers. They took down all the measurements, and then the farmer came over and said, oi, do you know, there's going to be another crop circle that appeared last night in the field next door. Really? And he showed them a photograph. It's absolutely identical. In fact, here they are, side by side, the 2 crop circles. So whoever was making it had a lot of time on their hands. They did one, and then they went to the next field and made it again. And they went and measured the second design, and they had a series of discrepancies, small discrepancies between the 2 designs. So being engineers and mathematicians and physicists, they began to look at the numbers, as they tend to do. And they realized, wait a minute, there's a series of numbers here which is actually telling us what we know about the speed of light. So they began to look at the second series of numbers, and they thought, well, if you extrapolate this, you should be able to get this, which is basically the second speed of light, and the third series of numbers is the third speed of light. So they put this to a peer-reviewed panel. They got laughed out of the room, of course. I mean, hoaxers can't possibly be knowing anything about physics, and there is only one speed of light. We don't have a second speed of light, let alone a third. And would you believe that 5 years later, someone somewhere, some physicist somewhere in the world, presented a paper. They said, well, actually, light travels in 2 different speeds. So whoever put this down here is 3 steps ahead of us. And that was the first inkling that we were being given information that's trying to advance our understanding of how we understand the world, because we know so little of it. For example, we hardly know anything about gravity. It's a mysterious substance. The world is covered by 2/3 of water, and yet we know so little about this wondrous and mysterious substance.